All right, in this video, we're going to look at the 4 urban models that we would associate with the United States in the 20th century. So they are the concentric zone model, the HOYT sector model, the multiple nuclei model, and the galactic city model. So we're going to go through and talk about each one and talk about how cities grow and what they look like at different time periods in the United States. So this is our old friend, this slide. this slide's helpful in a couple different areas. But kind of thinking about what we talked about with Borchert, you have the dramatic expansion of the U.S. city, and what we are seeing is it expanding in a lot of ways based on the emerging transportation innovations that are happening within a given period. So here we see kind of the big one is going to be the expansion of the automobile. We'll see the last 2 models are made possible by the automobile and are effect sort of outreaches or outstretches of the automobile and the different ways in which the automobile shapes cities. But we're going to start back in the 1920s. This is called the concentric zone model, or the concentric ring model, or sometimes the Burgess model. We like to have different things to refer to the same thing in this class, but I call it the concentric zone model. So mainly because it uses concentric zones, concentric rings. So thinking about the United States and cities in the US in the 1920s, we have a model that pretty heavily follows Bitterant model, right? You have the central business district right in the center of the bullseye, and around it you have a light ring of manufacturing and wholesale. So you have, thinking about this time period, probably a train station downtown, a lot of business that is associated with that or connected to that. And then you have residential areas kind of emanating from the kind of stretching out from the city. And closest is lower class residential or lower economic zones residential. So as we talked about with bid rent model, this is because we had a lot of tenement housing, a lot of apartments, a lot of costs that were incurred by lower kind of economic classes as they were probably working in the city center or in the manufacturing near the city and needed to be close to where they worked because of the lack of technology around, transportation. So they didn't have cars, probably didn't have easy ways to get in, so they had to live near where they worked. And hence we see lower economic classes living closer to the city center. And there's all sorts of interesting ways in which, race and ethnicity and class and geography sort of intersect at this time. You have the development of ethnic enclaves of different ethnicities living in cities. You have different economic, you have the sort of movements of enforced segregation of African Americans and other ethnic minorities in the United States. So lots of reasons why we have why there were kind of a lot of lower economic classes living closer to the city center, but a lot of also economic reasons too. And then kind of the further you get out from the city, the more likely you are to have kind of exclusive residential areas. So we have the middle class ring, and then the most exclusive residential areas. Probably the only people that had cars, although the automobile diffused pretty extensively to the middle classes kind of by the mid 1920s, early 1930s. So the concentric zone model. And what we might see is kind of different groups moving into higher income areas as they assimilate into the general population. So oftentimes when we talk about immigration at this time, we see that kind of process of assimilation happening with ethnic minorities and immigrant groups. All right, so here's a 3D version of the concentric zone model, where we have the CBD in the middle, the zone of transition around it. So that is discussing kind of that manufacturing zone in and around the commercial areas downtown. And then you have the residential rings on the outside. All right. And this is how we might apply it to a city in the 1920s. So Chicago, of course, because it's on a lake, cuts it in half. So you have kind of the CBD right in the middle. And then actually Chicago, fits this model pretty well. I think this model, as well as the next one, is actually based around Chicago. So we see a lot of kind of following it pretty closely in here. All right, so the next model is going to be called the HOYT sector model, or just the sector model. So it has kind of the same deal as the last one, really close to the last one, except instead of using rings to show this, it's going to use kind of wedge shapes. And the big thing you need to know is that these wedges are sort of oftentimes based around kind of emerging forms of transportation. So most of the time, this means roads that are connecting the city center to kind of the outside of the city. So we have some wedges that are based around light manufacturing and wholesale, some that are kind of exclusive or middle class residential areas. And that essentially shows you the impact that the automobile is starting to have. You're starting to have connections made between the city center and the outside of the city. And you're starting to see kind of, instead of taking this ring form, you're starting to see sort of wedges take the place in terms of shape. But a lot of the same general connections that we would make with the concentric zone model, you can kind of connect here. So here we see a 3D version of it, and we're going to keep it moving on to the multiple nuclei model. So I always kind of lump the first two models together. I think they are pretty similar. You only have the second version. The second model is just sort of an updated version of the first model with wedges, because people started to or the cities started to take different shapes. You have that kind of updated. So the multiple nuclei model is going to be different, and you're going to see some emerging differences. Mainly right here, we have kind of the thinking about the time period, the late 40s, early 50s, we have the development of what we would consider to be the suburbs. So these are the early days of suburbanization, and the city is starting to change. So the central business district is becoming not the only core of kind of business land use. You're having the development of multiple cores, many of which are on the outside of the city to start with. So, and you might also have the development of more cores sort of within the original city as well. So something like the airport coming in, or sort of a new industrial park might make it so we have kind of multiple parts of the city that are important or might be associated with higher land costs. So here we see kind of the skewing of bid rent in some ways, where you might have the development of multiple parts of the city that are actually kind of valued rather than just the CBD. So the most important part of this, as you can imagine, is other nuclei developing. So we have retail districts, we have industrial districts, we have light manufacturing and different, you might have office parks. Like I said, you might have some sort of airport industry, kind of that's a hub within the city. And we start to see metro areas developing on the outside of the city. So the kind of what we consider to be the downtown of suburban areas, the downtown of suburbs. So these are going to grow into what we're going to call edge cities, or cities that are developing on the edge of the original city. So the multiple nuclei model. And think about what is actually in here. You see a lot of different things in here, but and where things aren't that important, to be completely honest with you. It is interesting to look at some of the general trends within the housing. You still have lower class residential areas closest to the central business district and the industrial areas of town. You still have this kind of relationship of distance that exists within higher class neighborhoods to the outside. You know, they're still most likely to be in the residential suburbs of a kind of an area. But the where it might be is a little bit less important, right? So just to show you, this is, we use the term edge city, and I like the term edge city. There's 2 or 3 different terms to kind of mean the same thing. An edge city is the one that I think is most evocative of what we're actually talking about, right? Because you have these models, and right on the edge of these models, essentially, are kind of new suburbs that pop up. And many of these suburbs kind of end up growing into their own cities. So the one nearby us that I always refer to as Bellevue, because I always think that's a kind of a clear city in and of itself. But here are some of the ones that we see in Philadelphia. So edge cities are suburban nodes that have their own kind of downtown and their own kind of cores. All right, and the fourth one that we see is called the galactic city model. So that is what most cities, if we were going to classify them today, most cities today would fall under this category, right? As places that have many, many, many different cores. right? So this is an interesting map because this is where shopping malls are, or probably where shopping malls were. There probably some of these don't exist anymore. Within Atlanta, and each of these kind of represents what you would think of as, you know, its own little hub or its own little urban area. So you have the downtown Atlanta area, the CBD, in the original part of Atlanta, and then Atlanta is one of the most galactic of galactic cities, where you have tons and tons and tons and tons of suburbs. In Atlanta, rather being a city, even though of course Atlanta is a city and has its own CBD and has its own kind of urban area, it is also a collection of tons of kind of edge cities and suburbs that kind of glom together to make one giant urban area. So that's what we see in most urban kind of areas today, is that happening. All right, which the last thing I want to mention is the term urban sprawl. So this is would be considered kind of connected to the last model that we talked about, the galactic city. So this is where you have lower density kind of areas leapfrogging beyond the urban edge, where you have people building outward from the city at lower densities, usually through single family homes. Oftentimes there's, you know, people will drive until they qualify in terms of being able to afford housing. So urban sprawl is sort of what is seen as the consequence of this sort of this type of urban growth that we see in the galactic city model. All right, thanks. Bye.